Oh! Who's that I see walking in these woods? Why, it's Little Red Riding Hood. Hey there, Little Red Riding Hood. You sure are
Grandma, what big eyes you have. The better to see you with, my dear. I'm sure that you have probably heard those lines before, and you might also know that they're from the story Little Red Riding Hood. I'm really excited about today's talk and book and question because it's about fairy tales and Little Red Riding Hood, and I love fairy tales. I read them really often, listen to them in podcasts and things, so this is very exciting for me. So first of all, I thought we would just have a quick little clarification on, please stop, on what a fairy tale is. What makes a fairy tale different to another story? People argue about this, but generally a fairy tale is a story that has magical elements and characters. For example, witches and werewolves and mermaids and fairies and talking animals and spells and enchantments and things. So that's generally what we define as a fairy tale. Now, the fairy tales that you might know might come from movies that you've seen and stem from the Walt Disney Company. So they took the fairy tales, the older fairy tales, and changed them a little bit to make them a bit more suitable for children, because the original fairy tales weren't necessarily meant for children. And you might know the stories as beginning with Once Upon a Time and finishing with They All Lived Happily Ever After. That was something that wasn't always the case in the old fairy tales, which you're going to see today in the version of Little Red Riding Hood that I'm going to read. But the fairy tales that we know of today have mostly been around for a really long time. Not necessarily in movies or even books. In fact, that's how fairy tales first started, orally, by speaking. So, some time ago, not everybody knew how to read and write. In fact, only wealthy, rich people who could afford an education could read and write. So that meant that ordinary people who worked the land, were peasants, owned farms, they didn't always know how to read and write. So the stories were passed down by speaking them to one another. For example, a lady she wouldn't have been called a lady back then, a woman would have sat down with her children by the fire at night time and told the story of Little Red Riding Hood just from memory. And then her children would tell the story to their children, and their children would tell the story to their children, and that is how it was passed on for generations and generations and generations. And that's why we don't really know where a lot of fairy tales started, who created them. We just don't know. The version that I'm going to read you today was written down by a Frenchman called Charles Perrault about 400 years ago. Okay, so that's how old we're talking. Some of these fairy tales are hundreds, if not thousands of years old, which is really special. That's why I find them so interesting. But yeah, he talked to people, he went to see those peasants and people who worked the farms and didn't know how to read and write but knew these stories. They told him the stories and he wrote them down. So this is the 400-year-old version of Little Red Riding Hood, and how it finishes is the interesting part. After, I'm going to read you So I'm going to read you the story, and then after I'm going to ask you a question for you to answer on Seesaw, as usual. Alright, so this is the book that I have, Perrault's Fairy Tales. And I'm going to go to Little Red Riding Hood. Has a lot of others in there as well. Now it doesn't have a lot of illustrations, so I'm just going to read the story. Once upon a time, there was a little village girl, the prettiest that had ever been seen. Her mother doted on her. Her grandmother was even fonder, and made her a little red hood, which became her so well that everywhere she went by the name of Little Red Riding Hood. One day her mother, who had just made and baked some cakes, said to her, "Go and see how your grandmother is, for I have been told that she is ill. Take her a cake and this little pot of butter." Little Red Riding Hood set off at once for the house of her grandmother, who lived in another village. On her way through a wood, she met old Father Wolf. He would have very much liked to eat her, but dared not do so on account of some woodcutters who were in the forest. He asked her where she was going. The poor child, not knowing that it was dangerous to stop and listen to a wolf, said, "I am going to see my grandmother, and am taking her a cake and a pot of butter which my mother has sent to her." "Does she live far away?" asked the wolf. "Oh yes," replied Little Red Riding Hood. "It is yonder by the mill, which you can see right below there, and it is the first house in the village." "Well now," said the wolf, "I think I shall go and see her too. I will go by this path, and you by that path, and we will see who gets there first." The wolf set off running with all his might by the shorter road, and the little girl continued on her way by the longer road. As she went, she amused herself by gathering nuts, running after the butterflies, and making nosegays of the wild flowers which she found. The wolf was not long in reaching grandmother's house. He knocked. Tock, tock. "Who is there?" "It is your little daughter, Red Riding Hood," said the voice, disguising his voice, "and I bring you a cake and a little pot of butter as a present from my mother." The worthy grandmother was in bed, not being very well, and cried out, "Pull the peg and the latch will fall." The wolf drew out the peg and the door flew open. Then he sprang upon the poor lady and ate her up in less than no time, for he had been more than 3 days without food. After that he shut the door, lay down in the grandmother's bed, and waited for Little Red Riding Hood. Presently she came and knocked. Tock, tock. "Who is there?" Now Little Red Riding Hood, on hearing the wolf's gruff voice, was at first frightened, but thinking that her grandmother had a bad cold, she replied, "It is your daughter, Red Riding Hood, and I bring you a cake and a little pot of butter from my mother." Softening his voice, the wolf called out to her, "Pull out the peg and the latch will fall." Little Red Riding Hood drew out the peg and the door flew open. When he saw her enter, the wolf hid himself in the bed beneath the counterpane. "Put the cake and the little pot of butter on the bin," he said, "and come up on the bed with me." Little Red Riding Hood took off her clothes, but when she climbed up on the bed, she was astonished to see her grandmother looking in her nightgown. "Grandmother dear," she exclaimed, "what big arms you have! The better to embrace you, my child." "Grandmother dear, what big legs you have! The better to run with, my child." "Grandmother dear, what big ears you have! The better to hear with, my dear." "Grandmother dear, What big eyes you have. They're better to see with, my dear. Grandmother dear, what big teeth you have. The better to eat you with. With these words, the wicked wolf leaped upon Little Red Riding Hood and gobbled her up. That's how the story ends. I know of other versions of Little Red Riding Hood where that's not how it ends. In fact, I have another one here. This one is in Italian, it's not in English, but in this version, Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother trick the wolf and they survive. Sometimes a huntsman comes to rescue them and pulls them out of the belly of the wolf, but not in this 400-year-old story. Alright, so I'll put the question on Seesaw and you can answer it there. I look forward to reading your responses. I'm going to leave you with some illustrations of Little Red that have been done over the years, so you can look at them and have a listen to the song. Otherwise, stay safe and I will talk to you on Seesaw. Bye!
Oh! Who's that I see walking in these woods? Why, it's Little Red Riding Hood. Hey there, Little Red Riding Hood. You sure are looking good. You're everything a big bad wolf could want. Listen to me, Little Red Riding Hood.